Hello. Welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. My name is Matt. Thank you for listening. We left off last time with Henry Every and the crew of the Fancy somewhere in the southern Atlantic Ocean. Their holds were full of live sea turtles, fresh water, wine, salt, and human beings intended for the slave trade, as well as unbelievable riches. Their plunder, by this point, had mostly been converted into gold and silver, pearls, jewelry, diamonds, and other assorted gemstones, and the aforementioned slaves. There was a problem, though, for the pirates. While all of that plunder was really valuable, they really couldn't use any of it. I mean, sure, if you were to go to a tavern in 1696 and order a bottle of rum, the barkeep would probably accept a fancy gold diamond-studded tiara, or, a ruby. But you'd have to be a fool to make that trade. And any major purchases the pirates may have wanted to make, land or ships or other big investments, well, whoever sold that big purchase would certainly take a look at the payment. And at this moment, every Englishman in the world was on the lookout for scruffy sailors bearing gold, silver, or jewels. The pirates had to turn all of that plunder into smaller and untraceable coins. That means they needed a colonial governor who was willing to look the other way, for a price, who also had access to a mint, or at least a facility that would melt their precious metals down, that would also keep their mouths shut for an additional price. New York was probably their best option, but Henry Every didn't know New York. He didn't know Benjamin Fletcher. He was from England. I don't think he'd ever been to New York. As this story played out, there were a number of English governors along the Atlantic coasts of the West Indies and North America that were willing to play ball, but one governor in particular stands out. The first governor with which the pirates on board the Fancy met. His name was Nicholas Trott, and he was the governor of the Bahamas. This is episode 233, Fortune and Freedom. The Fancy was on the way to the Bahamas, and we're going to use this opportunity to introduce one of the main characters in the story that is to come. We're talking about the Bahamas, in particular New Providence Island and the capital city of Nassau. Nassau is a character in the story of the pirates. It's more than just a setting for the story of the pirates, similar to Port Royal or Tortuga, but really much more so. It's going to shape the story of the pirates moving forward. So today we're going to introduce her. Bahamian geography is going to be important to our story, but it's kind of tough to impart on a podcast. You'll do better with a map, and I will put one up on the website, but I'm going to try to do my best over the next couple of episodes to describe it. The Bahamas are made up of over 700 islands, but of course, not all islands are created equal. There are, by and large, roughly speaking, 3 distinct variations found in the Bahamas. There are the large islands covered in vegetation that are big enough for agriculture and habitation. Naturally, these are where the majority of the story will take place, but then there are the atolls. An atoll is a ring-shaped island formed from a spent volcano and usually atop a coral reef, and in the center of the ring shape is a body of water. There's a lot of atolls in the Bahamas, but they're really not good for all that much aside from being, kind of pretty. But you're not going to find much there aside from maybe a hidden treasure chest or a cache of rum. By far, though, the most common type of island in the Bahamas is the key. A key is just a small outcropping of sand, occasionally large enough to have some vegetation, maybe as much as a few palm trees, and they always sit atop a coral reef. That coral reef atop which they sit is essential to the formation of a key, officially speaking, at least. Colloquially, we tend to use the word key for any small island in a tropical climate, but they're supposed to be on top of a reef. In this context, the word key actually originated in the Bahamas, which kind of makes sense. The Spanish had never encountered islands like this when their first explorers arrived. They're named after the indigenous people that the Spanish encountered on their first voyages to the Bahamas, the Lucayan people. The Spanish called these tiny little islands Cayo, after the Lucayan. The Dutch called them Kai, and the English anglicized it to Keys. All of which is to say, if I slip up and call them K's at some point, don't blame me. I'm just following older pronunciations. That first Spanish encounter took place on 12 October 1492. That's when Christopher Columbus made his first landfall in the Americas. He did so at the island of Guanahanay, though the Spanish gave that island their own name. They called it San Salvador. There are a couple of things to note here. The Bahamas is a political distinction. The archipelago, in its complete geographical context, is called the Lucayan Archipelago. But then, of course, all of this ties into, well, what's become something of a controversy lately here in the U.S. Should October the 12th be celebrated as Columbus Day? Now, I don't make policy decisions, but I do have 2 points here. The Spanish arrival in the Americas was an undeniably momentous event in human history, one of the biggest events in human history. It changed the world forever. But there are no Lucayan people alive today, and that is a direct consequence of Christopher Columbus's decisions, of his actions, including mass slavery and genocide. In his book, The Story of the Bahamas, Paul Albury writes, quote, "After the Lucayans were taken away to slavery and death, a human silence settled over the Bahamas. The forests once again claimed the land which they had cleared to build their houses, to grow their crops, and to play their batos. It was almost as if the island people had never existed." End quote. Lucayan culture was wiped out by the Spanish. But it is odd. Even though they were a relatively small group of people and they were gone before the English arrived in the Americas, the Lucayan people do have a disproportionate impact on the English language. They were the first encounter that the Spanish had with a ton of Taino words, and the Spanish used those words, often from that particular Lucayan dialect, for all of the new stuff that they found in the Americas. Words that filtered through Spanish to English, words like hammock, hurricane, canoe, a bunch of crops like tobacco, potato, guava, maize, and cassava, not to mention, pertinent to our show, the words for boucan and barbecue, which through French give us buccaneers. But that passage we read by Paul Albury does make one other notable point. It's all about the forests of the Bahamas, their reclamation of Lucayan lands. And almost all of the Spanish sources, even the really early English sources, note that the islands were lush, dense, and filled with trees and shrubs and wildlife, almost tiny microcosms of a tropical rainforest. But when you picture the Bahamas today, or especially, say, in the early 1700s, they're pretty bare of greenery. There will be a few palm trees on some of the smaller islands, but the islands of any real size were almost completely cleared. That was an effect of human habitation, and, more specifically, the production of sugar. But that wouldn't come for about another 150 years. By the middle of the 1500s or so, the Bahamas were essentially deserted by human life. The Spanish found much better sugar-producing lands on Hispaniola, and of course Jamaica and Puerto Rico. And the Bahamas stayed empty for about a century. There were occasional explorers. For example, Ponce de Leon made a stop by the Bahamas on his search for the Fountain of Youth. There was an anonymous Spanish report that placed the Fountain of Youth at the island of Bimini. That anonymous source spoke of a natural spring with mystical healing properties that could restore health to anyone who bathed in it. But believe it or not, there actually is a pretty fantastic natural spring on the island with waters that are rich in minerals like calcium and magnesium, minerals that would have been difficult to come by in a sailor's diet of the 1500s. Bathing in it would certainly seem to have regenerative capabilities. Beyond that, though, not much in the way of human activity. In 1629, the English crown granted a governing commission to a small joint stock company, but that really never got off the ground. None of them even set foot in the Bahamas. But finally, in 1648, a small fleet of English Puritan settlers from Bermuda arrived in the region. Bermuda is out in the Atlantic, about 900 miles northeast of the Bahamas, and in 1648, Bermuda was a mostly Puritan settlement with pretty close ties to Oliver Cromwell. They also had close ties to Boston, what with the whole Puritan thing, and with Virginia, thanks to the Somers Isle Company. But Bermuda was actually getting pretty crowded in the 1640s, and one man on the island named William Sale had a plan. He outfitted 2 ships and 70 settlers, all of whom were of a particular bent in the Puritan faith. We'll talk about that in a second, but they decided to set a heading to the southwest and arrived in the Bahamas just a couple of weeks later. The details here are sketchy. Exact dates are hard to come by, but we do know that the flagship of this little fleet, the William, ran aground in a passage we know today as the Northeast Providence Passage. This is a particularly dangerous waterway filled with coral reefs and sandbars. It's the kind of place where an unwary pilot was likely to run aground with ease. It was also among the most traveled waterways in the Western Hemisphere in the age of sail. It's still in heavy use today, and we are going to be talking a lot more about the Northeast Providence Passage in the days to come. William Sale, though, ran aground on a long, thin island with moderate vegetation. In some areas, this island was very, very thin, less than a mile wide in some places. The Lucayan called this island Cigateo, but William Sale gave it a new name. This island, too, William Sale, represented a fresh start, free from all of the social norms and religious constrictions of the old world. After the old Greek word eleutheros, he called this island Eleutheria. Today we call it Eleuthera. William Sale founded the colony at Eleuthera on 2 pretty radical and even dangerous ideals: the freedom of religion and the principle of democracy. It's similar to the brand of radical Puritanism that we find in places like Rhode Island, where women had the right to vote, where they opposed slavery, which is radical and ahead of its time, but let us never forget that these were Puritans. No drinking, no dancing, no gambling, and no enjoying sex. Oh, and no Christmas. Deeply, deeply religious people. Now, this group of Puritan Bermudan sailors were not the same group as the Providence Island Company. You may remember them. Back in 1631, a group of Puritan pirates who also didn't drink or gamble or fornicate, well, they took over a Spanish island off the coast of Nicaragua. They called it Providence Island, today Providencia. Well, this was a different group of people, but They both came from Bermuda, and they both shared a lot of the same last names. A lot of the same families with these same principles were sending out different groups of settlers looking for that paradise where they could find freedom. And, politically speaking at least, they found it. That tiny little colony of no more than 70 settlers has the distinction of being the first Republican democracy in the Western Hemisphere. They set up a bicameral legislative body and dual executive offices, which, for a colony of 70 people, that's a lot of government. But they were a true democracy. What you might consider their lower house of their legislative body was every adult on the island who voted directly on many of the important issues they all faced. But then there was a smaller, elected governing body. And also elected 2 executives. And it was from those 2 executives that the first cracks began to form. They elected William Sale and another man whose name I'm not going to trouble you with, but there was a fairly major division between those 2 men, policy-wise. William Sale advocated for freedom of religion. That is, the right to practice your own faith as you see fit. But the other guy advocated for freedom from religion. It's unclear whether he was arguing for a heretical atheist state or whether he was arguing for a more significant division between church and state. And it's unclear because history is written by the victors, and I'm telling you all about William Sale and not even bothering you with the other guy's name. The point is, the settlers could never quite get a handle on this issue. Beyond that, there were also some fairly major problems. They got hit by a couple of hurricanes. They had trouble growing a proper amount of food. After only a couple of years, the settlers slunk back to Bermuda with their tails between their legs. Another group, a group of less doctrinal Puritans, less inclined to republicanism, tried a couple of years later. They had better ties with Puritan North America, which was a big leg up for them. They had a couple of 100 colonists, and thanks to regular infusions of foodstuffs and money from Boston, they lasted quite a bit longer than that first group. But even with all of that outside support, they just were never really able to get local agriculture up and running. Had they had the Lucano to show them the ropes, they'd have learned that they didn't get most of their food from farming. Instead, the Lucano did a kind of curated foraging. They had a lot of fruit trees on the island. They had berry bushes and cassava. They had a relatively small base of cultivated maize and yams and potatoes, but the real basis of the Lucano diet was the sea. They set up fish traps and fish farms, and they went hunting for big game on the open ocean. And that's really the missing ingredient in the Puritan colonists' diet. They did some fishing, absolutely, but it wasn't their primary food source, and it really needed to be. They did their best, but eventually, yes, they started going hungry as well. Not quite starving, but not far off. And before long, they started to slip away. Not in large groups, but one by one, or family by family. Whenever an English ship might stop by, they could expect to pick up some passengers bound for Jamaica or Virginia, or more and more, the most common stopping point was the newly founded colony of Carolina. Despite this, though, despite all of the immigration, the population of Eleuthera did not diminish. And it wasn't thanks to childbirth. It was because all of those colonies, Carolina, Jamaica, Boston, Virginia, they saw Eleuthera as a kind of a dumping ground for troublemakers in their colonies. Rabble-rousers especially, and especially people of color. Maybe the shameful mestizo children born to respectable white women, Well, they had to be hidden away from polite society, and where better to do that than on an island several hundred miles away? Or any of the free black people in their colony who were not slaves, but certainly weren't citizens. They don't fit into polite English colonial society, so they were shipped off to the Bahamas. Before long, you have this fairly large population living on Eleuthera. And by and large, they did better than the white colonists had, mostly because they were happy to eat fish and, more to the point, they weren't busy trying to grow sugar. All of their energy was spent building houses, producing and preserving food, and making babies. They were building lives on Eleuthera. And in fact, these are the first Bahamian residents to which any modern Bahamian people can trace their ancestry. But then, in 1666, everything changed. Up to that point, the Bahamas had been basically a company colony. They belonged to a joint stock company out of Bermuda, but they clearly weren't getting the job done. King Charles II shifted focus. He appointed a board of Lords Proprietor, based mostly out of Virginia and Carolina. The Lords Proprietor appointed their own governors of the territory and made all the big decisions. And their first big decision was to shift focus from Eleuthera to a small island just west of Eleuthera. On one of those supply runs to Boston, a few years earlier, William Sail had been sailing through that strait into the interior of the Bahamas when he was hit by yet another terrible storm. He lost his mast and his ship began to take on water. He believed this to be the day that he would die. He said his last prayers and prepared to meet his Lord. An indeterminate amount of time later, William Sail awoke, with the sun on his face, lying on a bed of soft sand and the waves lapping at his feet. He'd survived, miraculously, and he wasn't alone. Most of his crew survived the shipwreck, and they made their way to this small but lush little island. There were plentiful trees full of fruit. There were turtles to catch, fish in the sea, and even a good source of fresh water. It was, in William Sail's eyes, an act of God, a real miracle, and in thanks to the Lord he gave this island a name. He called it Providence. Now, that's a name that did not catch on at first, mainly because there was another Providence Island off the coast of Nicaragua. Instead, the people of the Bahamas called this island Sail's Island. But in 1666, when the Lords Proprietor sent their own colonists to Sail's Island, the Puritan faith was in decline. They wanted to distance themselves from William Sail and his friends. So they returned to the original name, Providence, but they did need to differentiate it from that other island. So they called this New Providence Island. And there on New Providence, this new generation of settlers under the Lords Proprietor, I was going to say they founded a settlement, but that's not accurate. Really, they found a settlement and they named it. There were already people living there, but these new colonists called this settlement Charlestown, after the king. Those people already in the settlement now called Charlestown were representative of what New Providence Island was going to become. They weren't pirates exactly. Some of them certainly had, and some of them certainly would engage in piracy, but they weren't, flying the black flag, declaring war against all mankind. Instead, they were really more of a human refuse. They were exiles. They were disgraced mercenaries and destitute one-time landowners. More than anything, though, they were sea-born adventurers, men not averse to a little piracy, but not given over to that way of life completely. Again, from the Story of the Bahamas, quote, "There was nothing high-minded about the purpose of these men, and nothing dramatic about their arrival. They were merely searching for more productive fields in which to ply their trade. Ambergris, Spanish wrecks, and salt first attracted them to the Bahamas, and they soon saw New Providence was an ideal headquarters for their ranging activities." End quote. These men were scavengers, and they were almost exclusively men here. In the early colonial era, women and civilization went hand in hand, but much like Tortuga in the very early days, and much like Madagascar in 1696, this was not yet civilization. What I called a settlement was really nothing more than a few shacks and lean-tos against the tree line, to provide at least a little protection from the elements. More often, though, these men just slept in hammocks when they were sleeping on land at all. Most of their time was spent scouring the beaches of nearby islands for ambergris, as well as signs of wrecked ships that they could salvage. But those colonists sent by the Lord's proprietor, well, they brought civilization with them. There were women on board their ships. They had building materials and machinery for processing sugar. They had hierarchy and an economy and slaves. And these new developments, though the responsibility of all the Lord's proprietor could really be laid mostly at the feet of one man, Christopher Monk, the Duke of Albemarle. And you should remember Albemarle. He's the man who would go on to be Henry Morgan's patron in London when Morgan arrived accused of piracy. He would later on serve as the lieutenant governor of Jamaica. He had a controlling interest in the Carolina colony, and he was the primary financial backer of William Phipps's 1684 treasure hunting expedition in the Bahamas. And here in 1666 he sat at the head of the Lord's proprietor. Albemarle had his fingers in every pot. Was he the founding father of English piracy? Maybe he was the godfather of the buccaneers. Well, I'll leave that up to you to decide. But yes, he was. These two groups, though, the scallywags and the colonists, are never really going to intermingle. The respectable slave-owning plantation owners, well, they set up shop further inland on New Providence where they could grow better sugar. They built manor houses and slave quarters and churches. But down by the harbor, the fantastic natural harbor that made New Providence such an ideal location and made it such an important location in our story, well, that's where the scum and villainy lived, where the rogues slept in hammocks and drank their weight in cheap rum, and that dichotomy would last for the rest of our time in New Providence Island, from here in 1666 all the way through Benjamin Hornigold, Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, and all of the pirates of the Republic at Nassau. The second Republican democracy in the Western Hemisphere. Next time, we're going to discuss the foundation myths of the pirate republic that is to come. One of the best books I've read about piracy, and I've read quite a few, is called Pirate Nests and the Rise of the British Empire, 1570 to 1740. It's by an excellent historian named Mark G. Hanna, who specializes in maritime history with an emphasis in piracy. As Madagascar enters the public eye in the late 1690s, and then with the rise of New Providence, we're going to be returning to that book as a reference more and more. There's a lot of good stuff in there, and I recommend picking up a copy if you're looking for a good, if in-depth read. It illustrates that there's something, well, not exactly unique to the British Empire, but something in their economic and political systems that lend themselves to piracy. You've got this kingdom shifting over to a parliamentary system. You've got a mercantile economy with tendrils of capitalism sneaking their way in both of which we can see parallels to and connections with piracy in the Golden Age. But more than all of that, really the overarching theme of the book is the imperial question. The English Empire, soon to be the British Empire, was expanding rapidly, really rapidly. The big cities in the colonial world, imperial centers like Boston or Kingston or Jamestown, they had royally sanctioned governors and a fair amount of support from the mother country. You've also got the company towns, most notably the East India Company fortress cities, as well as some other military outposts throughout the world. But all of that really is still only a fraction of the territory needed for the rate of English expansion. When you take into account the economic and religious and political disparities and the differing ideologies one finds within the English-speaking world, you needed more still. So you wind up with all of these unofficial colonies. You've got territories and frontiers that might or might not be sanctioned by the crown, but regardless, they get virtually no support whatsoever, at least not from home. Now, in those unofficial territories that lie farther inland or on the mainland, we tend to find the kind of rough and tumble men and women that we associate with frontier settlers. Hardy, religious, and usually farmers, trappers, and hunters. The naval front, though, distant islands and coastlines, that requires a different breed. They didn't have to be pirates, but in a world where everyone was snapping up territory, where Spain or Portugal had a claim on everything, and everyone was at war all the time, they did have to have ships with guns and know how to use them. And that means often, if not always, pirates. Or at least pirate-adjacent types. That's one of the early points in Pirate Nests and the Rise of the British Empire. Mark G. Hanna writes, quote, "Historians and fiction writers alike have been inclined to categorize pirate as a rigid and readily identifiable type. The modern historiography of English piracy is contingent on the individual detached from human society, in rebellion with the norms and hierarchies presumed to define landed society. This model not only simplifies the notions of piracy at sea, but also implies a homogeneous society on land, with shared social values and economic or political interests." He continues, "Even historians who attempt to transcend the romance of freebooters to make analytical arguments continue to describe pirates as detached apostates who renounced personal ties and social obligations on land." End quote. And that is a common problem, the assumption that a pirate as a social norm or construct even really exists. Most books on pirates start off with something like, "What is a pirate?" And of course I'm guilty of all of that as well. Painting pirates with a broad brush, one that fits my particular biases, but I do try to work around it as much as possible. Because pirates were a part of the world, but by definition they were simultaneously outcast. What's really fascinating to me, though, is the transition. What does it take to turn a group of more or less law-abiding citizens into outright outlaws? This is episode 234, Foundation Myths, Part 1. Today we're going to talk about what turned the Bahamas, and specifically New Providence Island, from a relatively respectable territory into the definitive pirate haven. When we left off, there was a smallish population of ne'er-do-wells in New Providence. Not pirates necessarily, but certainly scavengers. They collected ambergris and salt, and they sent out divers to salvage wrecks of Spanish ships that had wrecked in the Bahamas. Now, salt obviously was always needed in the age of sail. It was used to produce hardtack, the super tough ship's biscuit on most ships. It was also used to preserve meat. Without salt, you would starve to death. Ambergris is a substance formed in the gastrointestinal tract of sperm whales. It was, and occasionally still is, used in the production of high-end perfume. It's kind of illegal to use it in a lot of Western countries now, thanks to anti-whaling laws, and thanks to those same laws, we actually don't know that much about how it's actually produced biologically. But it wasn't until the 1660s and into the 1670s that the Western world was really beginning to figure out just how valuable ambergris could be as an ingredient in perfume. There were some few perfumeries that used ambergris in France, and at least one guy in Scotland, but it was still a pretty tightly held secret in the industry. You don't want your competitors to have your secret ingredient, after all. But it was an open enough secret that a ragtag group of sailors on New Providence Island knew to look for it. But I do wonder, were those ne'er-do-wells there by design, or was the ambergris a happy accident? It would be fascinating if the first sea-born scallywags on New Providence Island were there because of some perfumer in old Europe. But the Bahamas were a particularly noteworthy place to look for ambergris. It can be found on any shores in sperm whale territory. It's common in Japan, Australia, the Philippines, and Madagascar. But the Bahamas were particularly rich in ambergris. There's a lot of coastline in the archipelago, and a lot of clear, shallow water where you can find any that may be stuck or sunk. And beyond that, there are a lot of coral reefs in which ambergris might be found. The islands are almost kind of like a net designed to catch ambergris from all around the Atlantic world. But that net caught other things, namely, for our purposes, ships. The Bahamas were dangerous in the age of sail, still are, but worse in the age of sail. If you need an example of this, look at William Sail, the man who founded the colonies both on Eleuthera and New Providence Island. He shipwrecked on both of those islands. What made the age of sail so dangerous for the Bahamas was, well, the propulsion mechanism, the wind. Wind patterns could be and were dangerous all around the West Indies, but the Bahamas were maybe the worst. And I'm not talking just about storms and hurricanes and the like. I mean, regular winds could blow a ship off course and run her aground. Getting into the West Indies from the open Atlantic Ocean was a tricky bit of business, believe it or not. And naturally, that could vary depending on where you were coming from and where you were going, but let's say, for example, that you were a Spanish pilot headed to Havana. Or, if not Havana, Mexico works just as well. Now, there are a lot of approaches, and that depends on where you're coming from. If you were coming from Africa, you would most likely wind up in the Lesser Antilles, either the Windward Islands or the Leeward Islands. Now, you could sail into the open Caribbean Sea, but you probably weren't going to. There were dangerous doldrums in the Caribbean Sea that could leave you stranded on the open water, but even more than that, almost regardless of where you were going to in the West Indies, it was slower, thanks to the wind patterns, to take the open water. Unless you were stopping off at Cartagena or Maracaibo, that would delay your voyage by weeks. The much faster choice following the wind would be to continue on north and west, up the Atlantic rim of the West Indies. Now, if you were headed for Jamaica or Santo Domingo or Petit Guave, you could head through the Mona Passage between Puerto Rico and Hispaniola, but you're not. You're heading for Havana. You could sail north of Hispaniola, and in the early days of the Spanish-American Empire, this was a common choice, but it could be dangerous. The most famous ship ever to sail this route probably was the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción. Back in 1641, famously, she shipwrecked on an island in the southern Bahamas. Still, it was the most common route until about the 1650s. That was when a ragtag group of French exiles and buccaneers rose up on Tortuga and made the passage north of Hispaniola more and more dangerous. Still, there were several possible passages through the Greater Antilles that one might use. There was also the Windward Passage between Cuba and Hispaniola, a common haunt of pirates, but not how one would travel if going to Havana. None of those routes by the 1670s or so were preferred. Instead, most Spanish ships went what would have seemed out of the way, but given the geopolitical climate, made a lot more sense. Up near the northern end of the Bahamas, there were two potential passages into the West Indies. First, we have the Straits of Florida, between Florida and the Bahamas. This was most common for ships coming from or going to North America. That route was, as all passages into the West Indies were, dangerous. The most famous example of natural danger in the Straits of Florida was the wreck of the Spanish treasure ship, an Urca, in the 715 Spanish treasure fleet. That is a big story. A story for another day, though. Right now, we're going to focus on the other main route into the West Indies, the Northeast Providence Passage. That's a channel that passes between the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean Sea, just north of Eleuthera, New Providence Island, and the largest island in the Bahamas, Andros Island. Naturally, it was dangerous. There were coral reefs and shifting sandbars and wind patterns that could blow your ship off course. That was common everywhere, but it was safer than most. By the 1670s, the Northeast Providence Passage had become the overwhelmingly most popular sea route into the West Indies. A lot of this had to do with the Franco-Dutch War, also known as the Third Anglo-Dutch War. You remember that conflict when a whole new generation of Brethren of the Coast arrived as privateers in the New World. Because everyone was fighting everyone, the Northeast Providence Passage served as a kind of a back door to the West Indies. But it became a more and more entrenched sea route, especially when that war ended and so many of those privateers turned to piracy. You have all of the pirates from Saint-Domingue, like Lauro de Graaf, as well as their compatriots like Jan Willems and Thomas Paine. But then you have all of those pirates who would sail on the first Pacific adventure. John Coxon, Bartholomew Sharp, Edward Davis, that lot. Now they're all going to come to play in a minute, but for now, their mere presence made the passage north of Providence Island more and more attractive to the Spanish. And because it was such a dangerous sea route, there were wrecks, and those wrecks attracted scavengers. In the latter 1670s, thanks to all these new pirates and all of these wrecks that were happening, the balance between respectable slave-owning plantation owners inland on New Providence and the wreckers living near the coast, well, that balance shifted dramatically toward the wreckers. Dramatically enough, in fact, that it affected the government of the island. Officially, the governors of New Providence were supposed to be appointed by the Lords Proprietor, mainly rich landowners out of Bermuda, Carolina, and a couple in England. And officially, they were appointed by the Lords Proprietor. After William Sale finally left office, the Lords Proprietor appointed a Sir John Hayden as governor. But As far as I can tell, he never actually set foot in the Bahamas. He had estates in England and America to manage. He was an MP and had powerful friends in London. The governorship of the Bahamas was a nice piece of padding for his resume, but not really what you might call a job. In The Story of the Bahamas, Paul Albury writes, quote, "Locally, the seamen," and he's talking about the scoundrels and wreckers, "the seamen looked with great distaste on controls of any kind. Especially did they dislike paying shares of their proceeds to absentee landlords who never did anything for them except irritate them." End quote. Now, the tenure of this absentee governor lasted for 11 years, which is, of course, ridiculous, but that did give the town council in the Bahamas the ability to see to their own affairs. They governed themselves, and they even appointed their own governor. His name was John Wentworth. Officially speaking, Wentworth appears to have been recognized as a sort of acting governor, or maybe a deputy governor. At least he did deal with the Lords Proprietor on a number of occasions in a somewhat official capacity. We know this because the Lords Proprietor hated John Wentworth. He was a former privateer and had obvious sympathies for the wreckers. He supported the seafaring, privateering lot on New Providence Island. He even had this habit of handing out privateering commissions of his own that allowed the wreckers of New Providence to, if they so desired, go out hunting. Now, this was very illegal. First of all, they weren't at war. There was no reason to hand out wartime commissions. Second, Wentworth wasn't even really the governor. He had no royal authority to do anything. I like John Wentworth. Unfortunately, he's not going to last very long. The Lords Proprietor replaced him with a man who was more on their side, the side of the planters. When he arrived at Charlestown, this new governor found the locals living a, quote, lewd, licentious sort of life, and he promised to, quote, bring them to reason. That's a big job, bringing the scoundrels of New Providence Island to reason, and it didn't go well for him. Within just a few months, this new governor found himself packed on board a ship and sent off to Jamaica, where he disappeared from the historic record forever. Once this interim governor was out of the picture, the Lords Proprietor decided to buckle down, really fix this situation. In 1680, they appointed a new governor who was going to actually do the job, who was going to take New Providence Island in hand, crush these scallywags if need be, and make it a profitable, God-fearing colony. This governor's name was not important. He's not going to do any of that. He made big promises, none of which he managed to fulfill. In the meanwhile, the privateer set in New Providence appointed a governor whose name you do need to know, Robert Clark. Once again, he wasn't an officially appointed governor. He had no royal authority, but he was recognized as serving the duties of the governor by everyone. And at first, everybody seemed to be on board the Robert Clark train. At a meeting of the Lords of Trade and Plantations, we're talking about some bigwigs here, literally, Robert Clark was recorded as being a, quote, very honest, useful man. But he wasn't. When the Lords of Trade mentioned Robert Clark as an honest and useful man, it was because Robert Clark had some very good information about this stand-up sailor named Thomas Paine. Just a good guy, no trouble at all. You guys don't need to worry about Thomas Paine. He's not going to be among the worst pirates of the 1680s. But of course he was one of the worst pirates of the 1680s, though he was kind of a privateer. He did have a letter of marque, an illegal letter of marque granted by Robert Clark, who did not have the authority to hand it out, but a bit of a legal shield. And Payne wasn't the only privateer that Robert Clark gave a commission to. Other luminaries include John Coxon. That was after John Coxon left the Pacific Adventure behind after their raid on Panama. These were two of the bigger names, but they were by no means all of the privateers that Robert Clark was gathering. He was building kind of a privateer navy, not unlike that seen in Port Royal just a couple of decades earlier. The real prize, though, the big get for Governor Clark, was Jan Willems, who had a falling out with the Tortuga pirates and moved on to the Bahamas. Now, their job was supposed to be mostly defensive. See, whenever a Spanish ship wrecked in the Bahamas, anywhere in the West Indies really, but in the Bahamas in this case, it was Spain's policy to send out a ship to reclaim the cargo as soon as possible. In the early days of the salvaging operations from New Providence, that means that the wreckers had to get out there as fast as possible, grab as much as they could, and if they spied even a hint of sail on the horizon, beat a hasty retreat. But then all of these privateers, with expertise in fighting Spanish warships, well, they were there to defend the wreckers. When Spanish sails arrived on the scene, these privateers could sail out, distract them, lead them on a wild goose chase, and give the salvage operation as much time as they needed to get as much plunder as possible. Thanks to this defensive privateer armada, business was booming. With that extra coin came all of the amenities that the privateers had learned to expect in places like Tortuga and Port Royal. Establishments selling rum, establishments where you could gamble, and more than a few establishments offering pleasurable company. All of these amenities and the freedom offered at New Providence made the island more and more a popular spot for men of loose morals. But as more and more privateers were coming to New Providence, a problem arose. Those wrecks had done well for the relatively small salvage operations, but, only so many Spanish ships wrecked in the Bahamas a year. You were only going to make a set amount of money, and it wasn't a lot of money. All of those rum mongers, gambling dens, and prostitutes realized that this place may have been a brief boom town, but it didn't look like it was going to last until, with Governor Clark's blessings, some of those privateers decided to go out hunting Spanish prizes. These privateers were far more brutal than any pirates we've met so far. Not because they enjoyed it, although maybe they did. Attacking the Spanish was an age-old English tradition. But they were brutal because they had to be. See, when they captured a Spanish ship, they weren't just going to steal some valuables and send the ship off with her crew mostly alive and unharmed. They killed every man on board, down to the cabin boys. Then they carried off the valuables and sank the ship off some lonely bank fairly far from New Providence Island. You can see the game here. To any Spaniards who might stumble upon the wreck, it looked like the ship had just run aground. The crew got away, but they were lost at sea or eaten by sharks, who knows. Then, those English scavengers picked the bones clean. Distasteful, yes, but they did not, as far as the evidence suggested, kill the crew. But of course they did. But it's not like the Spanish were stupid here. They knew something fishy was going on, but they couldn't quite prove it. Mostly because there were so many legitimate wrecks in the region, who's to say which was which, a scavenging raid and a piratical execution? But it was a young man from Maine named William Phipps that changed everything. His 1681 voyage to salvage the Concepcion ruffled a lot of feathers. It also pointed a very bright spotlight at New Providence and at Governor Clark. When Phipps stopped at New Providence to gather supplies, he did so With the aid of the governor and all of the diplomatic fallout that followed Phipps's salvage operation, Governor Clark was frequently name-checked. This had probably less to do with Phipps and more to do with all of those murderous, piratical expeditions, but his name was on the radar. So the Lords Proprietor finally took action. They replaced Governor Clark. They tried to stabilize their little pirate nest. This news was relayed to the Lords of Trade in London in a letter from Governor Thomas Lynch of Jamaica. Lynch wrote, quote, "I have already pointed out to you the danger that might follow from the granting of commissions of war by the Governor of New Providence. From a vessel that came in last week, I learned that Governor Clark is removed, and one Lilbourne in his place, but I could not find out whether he means to continue the rapine or not. This fishing for wrecks draws all kinds of dissolute fellows to Providence. The Indies, in fact, are full of desperate rogues. The want of a frigate here has made pirates to increase in number and impudence." Privateering was a problem everywhere, but in the Bahamas, New Providence specifically, the Lords of Trade were particularly concerned. The new governor might have made some positive changes, but we will never know. He never even got a chance to take up the office. He did sail for New Providence and did make landfall in Charlestown, but just a few days after his arrival, a small fleet of Spanish ships arrived on the horizon. Last time we talked about the early piratical history of New Providence Island, which was really most of the history of the island. It may have been founded by Puritan settlers, and there were the recent sugar plantations cropping up that were clearing the wooded inland of New Providence, but it was mostly the pirates, or more accurately, salvage wreckers and privateers. Privateers that did have letters of marque from Governor Robert Clark, but Robert Clark didn't actually have the authority to do that. When we left off, Robert Clark had just been removed from office by the Lords Proprietor of the Bahamas and replaced, and a Spanish fleet was on their way to New Providence to revenge themselves against this burgeoning pirate haven. This is episode 235, Foundation Myths, Part 2. As governor of New Providence Island, Robert Clark built a privateer armada that included some pirates we already know, names like Thomas Paine, Jan Willems, and John Coxon. But there is another notable pirate in this fleet who we've only ever mentioned in passing. His name was Pierre Breha. Pierre Breha was one of the most prominent Bahamian pirates in those early days. He arrived from France to the West Indies in 1678 as a member of the fleet of the Comte d'Estrées. That fleet was intended to win the Franco-Dutch War for France, but famously, it wrecked on the 11th of May, 1678. Their very first landfall in the Americas was to run aground on a coral reef, and it left the fleet hobbled. The flagship Terrible and the Vice Admiral Bourbon had both run aground. They were totaled in the wreck, and the fleet was basically lost. Now, some of the sailors did stick around, and the fleet eventually reassembled, although with less strength than they had when they arrived, but Breha and his compatriots decided not to continue on with Comte d'Estrées. Instead, they made for Petit Goave, where they joined up with Michel de Grammont's crew. Later, in 1678, Breha sailed with Grammont against the raid on Maracaibo. There, he captured a 2-gun, 70-man frigate called the Saint Francois. It wasn't a huge ship, but it was fast, and it made Pierre Breha a captain. But even though he had a ship of his own, he was unable to secure a commission at Saint-Domingue, so he decided to try his luck elsewhere in the West Indies. Breha succeeded at New Providence Island. There, Breha met a fellow French privateer named Pierre Blot, and they decided to join forces. Their first action of note was, their plan was to go out and salvage some Spanish plunder from a nearby wreck, but when they got there, 2 Spanish ships were already on the scene. There was a pink, which you should remember, very shallow-bottomed boats good for the shallow waters of the Bahamas, and a bark under Spanish Captain Martin de Melgar. They were overseeing the salvage operation when the 2 French pirates attacked. But this was not a typical New Providence raid. Instead of killing all of the Spaniards and wrecking their ships on some faraway coast so they could cover up the evidence, these 2 did things in a much more traditional privateer fashion. They boarded the Spanish, took their treasure, and left them with enough food and water to get back home alive. Then, with the Spanish out of their hair, they went back to salvaging the wreck. In the end, they walked away with more than 200,000 pesos in Spanish silver, which is a good haul. But of course, the French pirates clearly weren't following the program here. They let Capitan Melgar go. He made it back to Havana and was able to give a full report to the governor there, José Fernández Córdoba, Ponce de León. This was the piece of evidence that for years now, the Spanish had been lacking in regard to piracy operations out of New Providence. It was the keystone for which Havana had been waiting, and it was just handed to them. Governor José Fernández Córdoba began planning his revenge. In the meanwhile, though, Breja was organizing another wrecking expedition in the Bahamas, this time with the English captains Conway Woolley, John Markham, and the Dutch captain Jan Cornelissen. It was a large wrecking operation, but before they departed, Jan Willems and Thomas Paine arrived on the scene. Thomas Paine had a brand new commission he'd received from Governor Thomas Lynch of Jamaica. That commission was for pirate hunting, and it actually helped him get out of some legal troubles in Jamaica, but Thomas Paine wasn't going to do any pirate hunting. Instead, he convinced all of those assembled wreckers to give up their salvage operation and sail for St. Augustine, Florida. The raid itself was actually pretty lackluster compared to other raids against the fortress. They captured some farmers out in the countryside, but when the pirates marched on St. Augustine proper, they found it to be a fully manned, well-armed, and vigilantly defended fortress city. The pirates never even reached the walls to storm them. They were chased off almost immediately. They did send a ransom demand back to St. Augustine for those captured farmers, but in response, instead of a few bags of coins, the Spanish sent out a cavalry division. A division that charged the pirate beachhead and forced the pirates to withdraw. This was not one of the great pirate raids, but it did have some consequences. This raid against St. Augustine proved to the Spanish that the pirates out of New Providence were out for loot, plunder, and booty, specifically Spanish loot. In their eyes, any action now taken against the colony at New Providence was fully justified. And we should be honest here, it absolutely was justified. I mean, what would you do if a gang of homeless, drunken foreign anarchists showed up and kidnapped a bunch of people? Now, the governor of Cuba had ample resources at his disposal. He could probably deal with this pirate threat on his own, but if he wanted to be sure to really stick it to New Providence, he would need the assistance of his immediate superior, the Viceroy of New Spain, Tomás de la Cerda, the third Marquis de la Laguna. And he did in fact write to the Viceroy, but de la Cerda had his own troubles with pirates at just about that time. Just a couple of months before the attempted raid on St. Augustine, Florida, Lauro de Graff attacked and captured the Mexican city of Veracruz. The Viceroy raised a militia force which would have been able to retake Veracruz with ease, but getting the militia there in time was a difficult proposition, so he tried another tactic. He enlisted a small force of private Spanish mercenary sailors, corsarios, many of whom were the feared Biscayers. These were Spain's answer to the pirates. They sailed on Veracruz and took the city back without a fight. The pirates fled in terror. De Graaf did go on to attack Campeche and some settlements on the Yucatan, but the corsarios chased after them. But once they rounded the Yucatan, the corsarios lost track of de Graaf and decided to put in at Havana. And wouldn't you know it, the governor of Cuba, José Fernández de Córdoba, had just received news of the raid on St. Augustine. All of a sudden, he found himself in need of a force of private, mercenary sailors with experience in dealing with pirates. And here they were, but he had a new commander for them. See, this operation was going to be different because the Bahamas were different. We're not talking about frigates on the relatively deep water of the rest of the West Indies firing volleys at each other from afar. No, this was a shallow water region, and the governor had a man with experience in these operations on hand. His name was Capitan Juan de Alarcón. The English called him Larco, and by the beginning of 1684, Alarcón had a fleet ready to sail, 2 barcolongo and at least 1 pink with well over 250 men. It was a fleet intended to destroy New Providence. Back in the Bahamas, though, the new governor had arrived. But they were still in the transition phase. Richard Lilburn had yet to take his office up officially. Still, he was going to be the new governor, and everyone knew it. And he had orders for all the residents of Charlestown, indeed the whole of the Bahamas. Thomas Paine and his associates were outlawed. They were to be hunted down and arrested. Then they would face justice. Any man caught doing business with the pirates was to be arrested, and his assets would be seized. Any man with knowledge of their dealings or whereabouts was to come forth, and any man harboring the pirates, well, he was likely to be executed. The English were particularly interested in capturing Breja, but they actually got some facts wrong. They thought he was an Englishman named Breshaw, who was apparently, in their eyes, a pirate mastermind in command of all the pirates in the West Indies. And it's hard to fault the governor for this decision. Pirates were a problem, and he was there to put an end to their depravities, but he did have a new problem. He was taking over a colony that had attacked and insulted the Spanish over and over and over again. The pirates that were responsible for all of those attacks and insults, though, were also his first line of defense. They had the guns and the ships and the men. They were the deterrent to Spanish retaliation. And now they were outlawed, and they were long gone. Charlestown was free of pirates now, but that means they also now had no defenses to speak of. Still, things were quieter in Charlestown with the pirates gone. On 18 January 1684, the people of New Providence Island were content. They were a growing colony of at least 400 men capable of bearing arms, free white men between about age 14 and death. They had double that in women, children, and slaves, a bit more, in fact. And all of this growth was thanks to a wave of immigration from all around the Atlantic world, but especially from the people of Eleuthera. Now that New Providence was booming, many Eleutherans moved over, especially the white population. Charlestown had a superior harbor and just better everything. The scoundrels down by the water aside, Charlestown was a bustling, up-and-coming little city. They had nice homes, lacquered and whitewashed. They had enough food for everyone. They had at least a pair of churches and a marketplace and a meeting hall for the governing council. They even had a nice little tavern, not the kill devil rum sinks common among the pirates, but a tidy establishment that served decent beer and excellent food, called the Wheel of Fortune. It was the kind of place where even respectable women would not be embarrassed to show their faces. Robert Lilburn was staying there at the Wheel of Fortune Inn. By this time he'd been in Charlestown a couple of weeks, and he did not yet have a place to live. Robert Clark had his own home out on the edge of town, but that was his own private property, not to be transferred over with the office. In fact, Robert Clark was at his home with his family and a few farmhands, and they were finishing up their work on the evening of the 18th of January. Meanwhile, some miles to the west of New Providence, a woodcutter named William Bell was on the final leg of a cutting expedition. He was returning home to New Providence. That same evening of 19 January, William Bell was at anchor off the coast of Andros Island, probably to put in for the night, probably enjoying a smoke and a drink before bed. I like to imagine him with his feet up, or maybe in his hammock, with a drink and a book in his lap, watching the sun sink below the horizon. And then a pair of ships appeared round the coast, headed straight for his little alcove. The watchman on board Bell's ship sounded the alarm, and all hands raced for their positions, but they were too late. In mere moments, 2 barks were bearing down on them. William Bell must have wondered, are they pirates? But no. When they hailed his little logging vessel, they were Spaniards. And that was worse. The Spanish ships weren't large, but they were perfect for raiding the Bahamas. And they were absolutely filled with Spaniards, all of whom were armed to the teeth. They carried steel, muskets, pistols, and grenados. These Spanish raiders captured William Bell's little sloop and brought Bell himself on board their own ship to serve as a guide for the pilot. With his life on the line, William Bell complied. Shortly after dark, the people of Charlestown on New Providence began to lay their heads down to rest. Several hours later, at 3 a.m. on the morning of 19 January 1684, Captain Juan de Alacron and his force of 250 soldiers put in at Rush's Bay. That was a bay about half a mile from the outskirts of Charlestown. Today it's called Delaporte Bay. But at the time, the closest house to Delaporte Bay was the home of Robert Clark. Lilburn filed a report with the Lords of Trade some weeks later, and it's one of the better accounts we have of what happened here. He writes of the beginning of the attack, quote, Juan de Larco, what the English called Alacron, with 250 Spaniards came down the harbor and landed at Captain Clark's, half a mile to the east of Charlestown. Captain Clark, being out of doors near the waterside, some men in ambush shot him through the thigh and cut his arms with a cutlass. End quote. Now, I do have a couple of questions. It's surprising that they landed so close to Governor Clark's house, but not out of the question. It was close to one of the best anchorages on New Providence, and they did have a guide who may have known where the former governor's house was. What I really want to know is, what was Clark doing out of doors at 3 a.m.? I think it's probable that Lilburn got that bit wrong. I think it more likely that the Spanish came upon his house, burst through the door, and attacked. But Clark was shot and sliced up a bit, but he was not killed. We don't know what happened to Clark's family or his friends and associates there. It's possible they were killed or wounded or taken away by the Spanish. Regardless, Lilburn goes on in his account, quote, They marched with all haste to the town, firing into some houses as they went, end quote. And that's, not a nice thing to do, but it's still only the beginning. As the Spanish reached Charlestown proper, they bypassed the town for now and instead headed for the harbor. There was a skeleton crew remaining on their 2 barks and their pink, and those 3 ships blockaded the harbor. Not a complete blockade. There were 3 pretty small ships, and the geography of the harbor at New Providence is important here. There are 2 ways out. We're going to be talking a lot about that in the future, but for now, that interesting geography did allow 2 of the ships to escape. However, in all the hustle and bustle, the Spanish who were marching into Charlestown marched to the harbor and took the remaining 4 ships there. They climbed aboard from the docks. The Spanish captured their crews, they tied them up, and they took control of the ship's guns. And I wonder if the town was wide awake yet. I assume so. There had been a fair bit of gunfire in the countryside, but it seems like at this moment most of the people in town were still rushing outside to see what the trouble was about. And it was at this moment that the Spanish fired off all of the big guns from those 4 ships into the town. Now, we're not talking about a massive 40-gun broadside here, maybe like 4 or 6 guns max. But still, there was a sudden eruption of big guns, noise, and smoke, and even though there were only a few, even a few cannonballs ripping through your town are going to cause a commotion. All of that, and the screaming, I imagine had a powerful psychological effect. Lilburn goes on in his account, quote, "Hearing the sound of their shot and seeing the flash, I ordered a great gun at my door to be fired, to give the alarm. But before it could be loaded, the Spaniards were firing into the house, and I slipped out the back door into the garden. A volley whistled past my head, and we fled into the woods behind the town, where several women and some men, but only one of them armed, were already come. Not knowing what had happened, we waited till evening." End quote. Which was the smart move for Lilburn here, but it is a problem for us. We lose the governor's first-hand account of the attack. He was hiding in the woods. He can't tell us the play-by-play here. There are some other sources, but they're sparse, and some of them are more like rumors or stories of dubious believability. They are, though, entertaining, after a fashion. One account tells us that the Spanish marched into town with former Governor Clark tied up to a stick carried by 2 men. Think Han Solo or Luke Skywalker at the Ewok village in Return of the Jedi. But I mean, imagine that. You're sound asleep, in bed next to your spouse, and then a loud crack in the night. You and your spouse jump out of bed, grab the kids, maybe your eldest carries the baby, but you don't have a gun. That's something everybody makes a point of here. There just weren't that many guns in Charlestown, especially now that all the privateers were gone. Then, as you're rushing out the door, you see a column of Spanish marauders marching past with the old governor hog-tied and screaming. I personally don't know how I deal with that. But not to worry, I am in luck. Since I'm assuming the role of a man in this scenario, I would be relieved of agency almost immediately. The Spanish shot more than a few men, and those that they didn't were clubbed in the head with a musket or run through. So I would get off easy. As usual, the women and girls had a tougher time of it. They were loaded on board these Spanish ships and locked in the holds to eventually be carted back to Cuba. And if you're an optimist, maybe they got married off or joined a convent. But I wouldn't bet on it. The Spanish, though, were in a rush, so here in Charlestown, they did not take the time to rape and pillage, just the pillaging. And the English did try to run, and some made it, like the governor and those in the woods with him. But most people in Charlestown were either wounded, killed, or kidnapped. Including, naturally, the slave population. They were all carted back to Cuba to continue their lives of enslavement. But with the inhabitants dealt with, the Spanish could take the time to loot every home as well as the tavern, the Wheel of Fortune, and the local warehouse. Now this wasn't a great haul, but plunder really wasn't the point here, though they did take all the food as well. The point was destruction and destitution. It was enough, though, that it would not fit on their 2 barks, so they also took the 2 largest ships in the harbor and all of the cargo on the other 2. They took everything. Everything that wasn't nailed down, and probably some stuff that was. By a bit after noon, the Spanish were done with Charlestown. With their departure, though, we can return to Governor Lilburn's account, and he does have a couple of interesting nuggets to add to the story. He and 20 of the strongest men that were out there in the woods, including the one man with a gun, returned to town. Then Lilburn writes, quote, "I kept watch that night, and the next day we brought in the people from the woods, but the town was miserably plundered. Some of the Spaniards' prisoners, who escaped, told us that they had a commission from the governor of Havana, and that it was a return for Vera Cruz," adding that I had granted commissions of that kind. But a letter of mine to one of the prisoners captured by the Spaniards was shown to them, which forbade all English to join in an attack on St. Augustine, and proved my innocence. End quote. That the Spanish blamed the people of New Providence for the attack on Vera Cruz is, well, it doesn't really make any sense. It's human nature, a pretty terrible part of human nature, to blame people of a particular group when other people in their particular group do something terrible. Take, for example, the treatment of many Muslim people after 9/11. It doesn't really make any sense, but you can see how people would make those connections, right? Here's the thing. In this case, you've got Lauro de Graaf, a Dutchman flying French colors, attacking Vera Cruz, and the Spanish retaliated against the English. And it seems like they blamed Lilburn, or perhaps that they didn't really understand that Lilburn was the new governor. They did know, though, that Governor Clark was their enemy, and the Spanish got their revenge against this patron of pirates. According to at least one questionable source, they marched Robert Clark, hogtied, remember, into the center of town, and once the killing was mostly done, they began to torture him. But it didn't last long. After a short period of torture, they cut his head off. They left his body there in the town square, but they took the head with them back to Havana to show the governor that they had indeed killed the man who had given them so much trouble. After departing New Providence, the Spanish sailed over to Eleuthera and had their way with that island as well. We know very little about what actually happened there. Remember, there weren't any white people left on Eleuthera, so nobody thought to care too much about what was happening over there. But rest assured, it wasn't great. In the months that followed this raid on New Providence Island, the people of Charlestown sued for the return of their families and their slaves and property. But the Spanish just dismissed it all out of hand. They weren't having any of it. According to a different contemporary account, quote, "The governor of Havana, when asked if he had authorized this," the attack they mean, "threatened further hostilities in spite of the evidence that Governor Lilburn had done all he could to prevent depredations on the Spaniards. Information has since been received that the governor of Havana has sent another party of men to New Providence, burned all the houses, murdered the governor, and several more in cold blood, stripped the rest of the men naked, and carried away the women, children, and Negroes to Havana." End quote. A second raid did occur, but it seems like that account may be getting a bit garbled with the first account, because Governor Lilburn wasn't killed, but Governor Clark was killed in the first attack. This second attack, though, well, it was the last straw, the final nail in the coffin. There weren't many people left on New Providence after the first attack, and there were even fewer after the second. And those that remained, well, most of them left. I mean, there wasn't anything there anymore. Their homes had been ravaged and burned. Their children and wives had been taken, and the few men that were left were probably very injured. Most went off to Jamaica and some to Carolina. And I do imagine that some of them turned to piracy, in a quest for revenge against the Spanish. It's a good origin story for a pirate. He could already be missing an eye, or maybe a hand. If there were any of these, though, we, or at least I, don't know their names. But that appeared to be that for the island of New Providence. It remained, as far as most of the world was concerned, abandoned for the next couple of years. Eventually, another colonization effort arrived on New Providence in 1689. The Lord's proprietor had changed. There were different men in charge, although officially it was the same body. But when that colonization effort arrived, they did find some squatters. It was a small group of the same kind of scavengers that had lived on New Providence for the last half a century or so. And thanks to the presence of these squatters already in residence, that old dichotomy between sea-born scallywags and the Christian planters, well, it continued on, and would continue on for the duration of our story in New Providence. This new group of settlers in 1689 had some changes to make, though. First of all, they resumed construction on the fortress there at Charlestown. They had begun it a few years earlier, but it was nowhere near done when the Spanish attacked. The most important thing, though, was the name. They couldn't go on calling it Charlestown. There's a superstition that when a town is so completely destroyed, as Charlestown was, it's bad luck to continue calling it the same town. Take the shift when Port Royal, Jamaica was destroyed to Kingston. Additionally, the English had just gone through their glorious revolution. King Charles was out of style, so they didn't want to continue calling it Charlestown. William III, the new King of England and the Prince of Orange, was also the Lord of Nassau. In fact, Orange Nassau was a single title. But that seemed good enough for the people of New Providence. They changed their city's name to Nassau, New Providence Island. These colonists elected a couple of governors over the following few years. Neither were very important. One was fine, the other was a nightmare. But it was the third governor elected after the 1684 attack that's going to have a real impact on our story. His name was Nicholas Trott, and 2 years after his election in 1696, it was Nicholas Trott that welcomed Henry Every and the crew of the Fancy to Nassau. I would like to thank everybody for listening. I'd like to thank everybody who has helped to support the show, everybody who has signed up to become a patron on Patreon, anybody who has left us ratings or reviews, and everybody who has recommended this show. Without all of you, we wouldn't be able to do this. Thank you. Our theme music was The Old Captain by the fantastic band Brillig. If you haven't checked them out yet, you absolutely should do so. You can find them at brillig.com.au. That's brillig.com.au. After you're done over there, why not check out our website at piratehistorypodcast.com. As always, and most importantly, thank you for listening.